I've worked as a caretaker and sacristan for the old church in Ouro Preto for years. It's a beautiful building, but one that carries the weight of its history in every creak of the wooden floorboards and every whisper of the wind through its stained glass windows. The church sits on the edge of a centuries-old cemetery, the graves long forgotten by most except for the occasional tourist. I've always felt a strange connection to the place, almost like it had a soul of its own. At night, though, it changes. The warm glow of sunlight replaced by shadows that seem to stretch and shift on their own. The silence can be deafening, broken only by the occasional scuttle of rats or the distant toll of a bell that no one remembers ringing. Over the years, I've brushed off the occasional odd occurrence. Candles extinguishing on their own. Faint whispers that seem to come from the rafters when no one else is there. I've always convinced myself it's the building settling, or the wind. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night started like any other. I had finished my duties, cleaning the altar, tidying the pews, and retired to the small room behind the sanctuary where I slept. As I lay in bed, the stillness of the night wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. And then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound at first. Chanting. It wasn't unusual to hear sounds echoing through the old halls. But this was different. It was rhythmic, melodic even, as if a mass were being held. But I knew better. There was no one in the church but me, or so I thought. The chanting grew louder, filling the silence with an otherworldly harmony. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was deliberate, like a congregation in prayer. I could make out the distinct rise and fall of voices, blending into a chilling unity. I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to stay put. But curiosity, and maybe a sense of duty, overpowered my fear. I grabbed the small flashlight from my nightstand, its dim beam barely cutting through the darkness, and stepped into the hallway. As I approached the main sanctuary, a soft light spilled out from under the heavy oak doors. It was unnatural, pale and cold, nothing like the warm glow of the chandeliers during evening services. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't left any lights on. The closer I got, the more vivid the chanting became. It was in Latin, the kind of solemn liturgy we rarely used anymore. Yet there was something unsettling about it, like the words were being spoken by voices that didn't belong. When I finally pushed the door open, the sight stopped me in my tracks. The pews were full. Figures sat in perfect rows, their heads bowed in reverence, their hands clasped in silent prayer. The air was thick with the scent of burning candles, yet the flame seemed suspended, flickering unnaturally in the still air. The light, I realized, was coming from the altar. A single, massive candelabra burned brightly, casting eerie shadows that danced across the stone walls. But there was no one there to light it. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The figures in the pews, they weren't people. Not really. My hands trembled as I tightened my grip on the flashlight, its beam flickering weakly against the surreal scene before me. The figures in the pews didn't move. They remained eerily still, their postures rigid, as though frozen in time. I took a cautious step closer, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. It was then that I truly saw them. Skeletal forms cloaked in tattered remnants of what once might have been fine garments. The yellowed bones were weathered, some cracked, yet they sat with an unnatural precision. Their empty sockets seemed to stare straight ahead, fixed on the glowing altar. My breath hitched as one of the skeletons turned its head. The motion was slow, deliberate, as if it had sensed my presence. The hollow gaze locked onto me, and though it had no eyes, I felt its scrutiny, an icy chill creeping up my spine. Suddenly, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against my ears. The figures in the pews began to shift, their bony hands gripping the edges of the benches as they started to rise. One by one, panic surged through me. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. Its beam spun wildly, illuminating the skeletal congregation in sharp, jarring flashes. And then, as if on cue, they all turned toward me. Their movements were unnaturally fluid, their heads cocking to the side in unison. The sound of bones creaking and joints popping echoed through the sanctuary, a grotesque symphony that made my stomach churn. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My legs felt like lead as the first skeleton stepped out into the aisle, its bony feet clicking softly against the floor. It extended a hand toward me, its long, skeletal fingers curling in a gesture that felt more like a command than an invitation. The air around me felt heavy, suffocating, as though the church itself had come alive to trap me. The skeletons moved closer, their steps deliberate and eerily synchronized. Despite the terror clutching at my chest, I forced myself to back away, my feet stumbling over the uneven floorboards. "Who's there?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. But I knew, deep down, I was not speaking to the living. The figure at the front, the one closest to the altar, raised its hand. The action silenced the faint shuffling of the others, and I watched in disbelief as it knelt before the glowing crucifix, its bony fingers clasped together in a mimicry of prayer, its jaw moving as if murmuring words I couldn't hear. The others followed suit, kneeling in unison. The sight was grotesque, their brittle forms bending and creaking, yet it carried an air of solemn reverence. The flickering light from the altar bathed them in a haunting glow, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. I couldn't comprehend what I was witnessing. Were they trapped spirits, bound to this sacred ground, or something far darker, performing a ritual I dared not understand? My heartbeat thundered in my ears as the first notes of a hymn began to echo through the sanctuary. But there were no instruments, no choir. The sound came from the skeletons themselves, their jaws opening and closing in a horrifying semblance of singing. The melody was both beautiful and deeply unsettling, carrying an ancient sorrow that made my chest ache. I couldn't stay. I had to leave. My instinct screamed at me to turn and run, to escape this unholy congregation. But as I tried to move, I felt it, a presence behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I froze, too terrified to turn around. A cold breath brushed against my ear, and a voice, low and guttural, whispered, "Join us." That whisper, it pierced through my chest like a blade. I spun around, desperate to see who or what had spoken. But there was no one behind me, only the yawning darkness of the church's entryway. The hymn continued to rise, a haunting crescendo that seemed to vibrate through my bones. My legs trembled, and I stumbled backward, almost losing my balance. The skeletons remained kneeling, their hollow eyes fixed on the altar, their voices carrying that otherworldly song. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of my terror. My words were swallowed by the hymn, unnoticed, unacknowledged. I turned and bolted toward the door, each step feeling like I was wading through thick, invisible tar. The air pressed against me, resisting my every movement. The temperature plummeted, my breath forming white puffs that disappeared as quickly as they came. As I reached the heavy wooden doors, I threw my weight against them, praying they would budge. They creaked open, just wide enough for me to slip through. The icy night air hit me like a slap, and I gasped, filling my lungs with its sharp chill. I didn't stop running. Gravel crunched under my feet as I sprinted past the cemetery, the gravestones seeming to lean toward me in the moonlight. I dared not look back, but I could feel it. Something was following me. The hymn had stopped, replaced by the faint echo of footsteps that didn't belong to me. When I finally reached the safety of my quarters, I slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against the solid wood. My chest heaved, my ears straining to hear anything outside. Silence. Minutes passed, then hours. But sleep never came. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the window, sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the image of those skeletal figures, their haunting him, or that whisper in my ear. The next morning, I resigned from my duties. I left the church and the cemetery behind, never daring to return. But even now, as I sit here recounting this, I feel their presence. Sometimes, late at night, I hear faint singing, low, mournful hymns that seem to seep through the walls. And I wonder, did I truly escape? Or did they let me go, knowing they'd find me again?